Because now let's go to Hebrews 1:3 from the Jehovah's Witness Bible. That he says Jesus is a copy. Well, let's see. Okay, you ready? Okay. Hebrews 1:3. Let me actually read it from the Jehovah's Witness Bible. Does this show that Jesus is a created God? Well, let's see. Okay. Hebrews 1, verses 2 to 3, from the 1961 Revised Edition of the New World Translation of the Holy Scriptures. That's the Jehovah's Witness Bible. And the 2013 edition reads virtually identically. Pay attention. Has at the end of these days spoken to us by means of a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the system of things. But that's not the part I want you to focus on. He is the reflection of his glory. Here's the part. And the exact representation of his very being. And Jesus sustains all things by the word of his power. Okay, here's the part I want you to focus on. Okay, here's the part. This is the Jehovah's Witness Bible. They translate the Greek word character as the exact representation. It can also mean exact copy or imprint of his very being, which is why Jesus is able to sustain all creation by his powerful word. So let me ask you a series of questions. What kind of power must Jesus have that by his command, his word, his voice, every created thing in all of creation, the billions of galaxies and the billions of stars, the sun and moon and stars, plant life, botanical life, marine life, angelic creatures, human beings, human cells, brain activity, heart pumping, all of that is being preserved alive and sustained by Jesus' word. What kind of power must he have to do that? Okay, so all powerful, right? But if he's actively sustaining the whole creation by his powerful word, is there a creature that Jesus is not aware of? If he's sustaining every created thing, every cell, every star, that means he must be aware of the existence of every created thing because he's sustaining it. Well, that means he's omniscient and omnipresent. So that right there shows Jesus is not a creature, but let's put that aside. Here's what I want you to focus on. The exact representation, character of his very being. Because Stafford, again, is being exposed as being stupid because he's demonically stupid and Jesus humiliating him. He says, see, a copy, that's a temporal distinction because we know copies come later in time. So if Jesus is a copy, that's a temporal distinction from Jehovah because a copy comes later. See, again, this is why I said Jehovah Jesus makes him look stupid. Yes, it's true that when we talk about created things being copied, the copy will be later than the original because we're talking about created objects, items in creation, where a copy by its very nature must come later from the original. To then assume that the word character must have this temporal limitation or implication when describing the relationship of the Son to the Father shows that you are a Bible pervert and God is embarrassing you, showing you you're stupid. What do I mean? Let me explain what I mean. How can Jesus, if he's a finite creature, you got to pay attention here, guys. How can Jesus, if he's a finite creature, be the exact copy of God's being when God's being, by its very nature, is infinite? It's not limited. It's atemporal. It's beginningless. It's uncreated. And some of the essential characteristics of God's being include being uncreated, all-powerful, all-knowing. If Jesus is created, that means he's a finite, temporal creature who's limited in power, bound to time. How can that be an exact copy of a being that's infinite, eternal, uncreated? That would be a very pathetic, poor copy. Right? If he's the exact copy of God's being, that means every essential characteristic that are part and parcel of God's being, that are essential to the being of God, Jesus must possess fully, completely, and perfectly. Otherwise, he's not the exact representation. I'll repeat it again. If you get this argument, you have buried Stafford and his lies. I'm not lying. how can Jesus be the exact representation of God's being without him possessing every essential characteristic that is essential to the being of God, that make up the being of God? Well, one of the essential characteristics of God's being is that he's uncreated. For Jesus to be the exact representation of God's being, he must possess all those necessary attributes, characteristics that make up that being. Well, if he's a creature, that means he lacks the characteristic of uncreatedness. But God's being is uncreated. A creature cannot be the exact representation of God's being if it lacks that essential characteristic of being uncreated. You see the problem? You see the problem? The only way Jesus can be the exact representation of God's being is if that he perfectly, exactly possesses all of those essential characteristics of the being of God. Characteristics such as uncreatedness, beginningless, atemporality, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence. You with me there? But since there's only one being that's infinite, uncreated, beginningless, atemporal, one being that possesses the characteristics of omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, that means the reason why Jesus is the exact copy of God's being is because it's the being of God that he fully, completely possesses. Because you can't have a second being that's eternal, uncreated, infinite. You get it? Before I move on? And now to show you how this destroys Jesus being a creature, okay? Destroys it from the Jehovah's Witness Bible. If you guys are getting it, that's it. You will become irrefutable in destroying the blasphemies against the Trinity with the hopes they repent of their blasphemy and live. Here it is again, and the exact representation, character of his very being, and he sustains all things by the word of his power. Okay. This proves Jesus can't be a creature. Why? The Jehovah's Witness Bible, Psalm 86, verses 8 to 10. Psalm 86, verses 8 to 10. Guys, pay attention. To Stafford, angelic creatures are gods and sons of God, but a lesser sense than the true God. Okay, watch this. Psalm 86, verses 8 to 10. There is none like you among the gods. Okay, let me repeat that again. There is none like you among the gods, O Jehovah, and there are no works like yours. None of the gods can do the works you do, the way you do it. All the nations that you made will come and bow down before you, O Jehovah, and they will give glory to your name. For you are great and do wondrous things. You are God, you alone. So none of the gods that Stafford believes are real gods, angelic creatures who are gods, in a lesser sense, are like Jehovah, nor can they do the works that Jehovah does and the way Jehovah does it. Keep that in mind. Psalm 89, verses 5 to 8. Psalm 89, verses 5 to 8. The heavens praise your marvels, O Jehovah. Psalm 89, verses 5 to 8. Yes, your faithfulness in the congregation of the holy ones. For who in the skies can compare to Jehovah? Answer, nobody. Who among, this is where it's over. You've blown to smithereens his lies. Who among the sons of God is like Jehovah? So the heavenly sons of God, is there any one of them like Jehovah? No. God is held in awe in the council of holy ones. He is grand and awe-inspiring to all who are around him. O Jehovah, God of armies, who is mighty like you, O Jah? Your faithfulness surrounds you. Now Stafford has another problem. Here we're told in Psalm 86, 8 to 10, and Psalm 89, 5 to 8, none of the heavenly sons of God, none of the heavenly gods, whom Stafford believes are angelic creatures, are like Jehovah, resemble Jehovah, are mighty like Jehovah, and can do the works that Jehovah does the way Jehovah does it. But hold on. Jesus is the Son of God, who is exactly like the Father, because he's the exact representation of the Father's being, who's just as mighty as the Father, because like the Father, he sustains all creation by his powerful word, showing he's just as mighty as God the Father. How, if the New Testament doesn't contradict the Old Testament, and if Jesus is a creature? How? How can Jesus be the exact representation of God's being, meaning he's exactly like the Father? And how can Jesus be just as mighty as the Father? Because like the Father, he sustains all creation by his powerful word, meaning he's just as mighty as the Father is and does the works that the Father does and the way the Father does them. If Stafford is right, Jesus is a creature and one of these created angelic sons of God. How? So you see what Stafford does? Not only does he butcher the New Testament and blaspheme Jesus, he interprets the New Testament in such a way that it contradicts the Old Testament. In other words, Jesus is not a God and an angelic son of God, an angelic created spirit being, because then he could not be exactly like the Father and as mighty as the Father.